Hi everyone, my name is Natalia Orrego. I am a PhD student at the Pontifical Catholic University of Chile, and most importantly for this context, I am the editorial assistant here at the journal Big Data and Society. Today we have a very interesting conversation with Sahana Udupa, professor of media anthropology at the Ludwig Maximilian University at Munich and principal researcher of the 4 Digital Dignity Research Group at the same university. Additionally, she is the recipient of the Bergman Klein Fellowship and John Shorstein Fellowship at Harvard University and Frankfurt Chair in Belgium. She has won several grants, and we will learn more about her projects from her in a bit. And she has published widely on online extreme speech, disinformation, content moderation, decoloniality, and more. If you want to know more all about her fascinating things and everything she has done, apart from inviting you to read her work, you can follow her on Twitter and just get to know her a bit. So now, this conversation will focus on a particular paper from the journal, Ethical Scaling for Content Moderation, Extreme Speech in the Insignificance of Artificial Intelligence, which he wrote alongside Antonis Maronikolakis and Axel Winsiorek. This paper is very important for us because it received the 2024 Outstanding Article Award from the International Communication Association. So congratulations for this very fascinating paper. And my first question, can you tell us more about the paper? What is ethical scaling? And then we can keep on the conversation.
Thank you, Natalia. Thanks for this invitation and thanks for your wishes. And I'm so happy that this article was published in your journal. This article is about artificial intelligence, something that seems to figure in every discussion these days, and content moderation on social media. So given the problem of hateful expressions, misinformation, and disinformation on online media, companies are increasingly turning to AI as a solution. Our article, co-authored with Antonis Marinokolakis and Axel Winsiorek, as you mentioned, highlights many different challenges in AI-assisted content moderation, and it stresses the importance of community participation and proposes a process for community-based iteration that we call ethical scaling. I'll define ethical scaling very soon, but let me begin with some of these challenges. One of the key challenges is the quality, scope, and inclusivity of training data sets. Hate speakers evade automated detection by using very cleverly different kinds of words and expressions and symbols. And these hateful expressions keep shifting. And this dynamism is also another challenge. There are language-based asymmetries and uneven allocation of corporate and state resources for content moderation. And that's another serious issue. And this affects minoritized language communities especially hard. So on the one hand, we have complexity of expression. On the other hand, we also have language disparity. I've been researching extreme speech for some years now, and the question that often bothers us when you do research is, what do we do about this? And there is so much hype around AI, and how do we explore its possibilities in extreme speech? That's what motivated me to start this project and write this article with my team members. And once this question begins to bother you, what to do with extreme speech, I also started fiddling with some hate detection models that were available on the web for anybody to use. And Google's Perspective API is one such model. And I started giving it some terms like you are an anti-national, and I wanted to see if it can pick it up as a toxic expression, because Perspective API model gives toxicity scores when you enter a passage. And I entered this particular expression, you are an anti-national, and the score, the toxicity score was not very high. It was just 0.59. We all know that in xenophobic context, this can be extremely dangerous if somebody accuses somebody of being anti-national. And then I gave another expression, you are a nationalist moron. And this model gave a higher score of 0.97. And it said, this expression may violate community guidelines. And clearly, this was picking up that trigger word moron, which probably it saw as toxic. But when I said you are an anti-national, I didn't see that as problematic. But contextually, one might think of this expression nationalist moron as a challenge to regressive nationalist jingoism. So these are the variations and contextual complexities of toxic expressions that some of these models are not able to pick up. And I did this little test in 2020. And in 2021, when we launched this new project, AI for Dignity, we did it systematically. We curated extreme speech data sets from Germany, Kenya, India, and Brazil. And we found some interesting results. The model performed better for extreme speech expressions in English language in Germany compared to India and Kenya. So culturally specific use of English was also an issue. The model was finding it difficult to understand culturally specific use of language, especially here, English language. So, of course, the model performed better for German only and Portuguese only passages compared to mixed language passages. And when we tested, Hindi had just then been added on Perspective API, and only toxicity score was available. And Swahili was not even included in the Perspective model. So what we see here is language variation and also cultural variation in the use of English itself that the Perspective model found it difficult to catch. Although German language detection was better than Hindi and other languages, here again we found many different problems. For instance, expressions that had English trigger words like shithole countries and different other kinds of obvious expressions of hate were easily found by the model. But if the expressions in German were more complex and indirect, then it was difficult for it to detect hate. So we have given several examples in the article. And this experiment we did in 2021, 2022. So a lot has changed in the world of LLMs and LMMs, large multimodal models since then. Clearly, this technology is developing at such a fast pace. There are more sophisticated models today that can understand and generate complex interactions. At the same time, paradoxically, we know little about how large models have been trained, what parameters and weights have been used, what temperature they've been set at, and so on. So by testing the model with extreme speech datasets and defining the process through which we collected these datasets, our article picks up this critical issue of bias, lack of transparency, and accountability. So algorithms, as we know, are always the product of social, technical, and political decisions and negotiations that occur throughout their development and implementation. And therefore, the process of choosing and labeling information that feeds this machine is never neutral. And the challenge is to ensure that this decision-making process is embedded within democratic and responsible processes, however messy these processes might be. And I think this is where we started developing a critical framework based on some of the experiments that we did. And ethical scaling is the framework that we propose in this article. And I think by briefly describing that, I will end my response to your first question, which is this concept of ethical scaling. In this framework, we extend some fascinating debates in scholarship around scaling. And around scaling, you get some interesting discussions by Jennifer Slack, Nick Seaver, and others. Ethical scaling stresses that scaling is not only about socio-technical scale making, but it is also political maneuvering. Scaling as a process that makes small have large effects and proceduralizes this process for replication in different contexts. And this is the kind of technical definition of scaling. And it is not just socio-technical, it is also and vitally a political one. It is political precisely because in the content moderation space, it raises questions around how and whom it involves as human annotators, the extent of resources and imaginations of technology that guide this process, and the deeper colonial histories that frame the logics of market, race, and rationality within which this entire thing is embedded. And we define this combined attention to replicable moderation process as political praxis and criticism of capitalist data hunger as ethical scaling. And therefore, in ethical scaling, how do we replicate processes? We replicate processes in ways to modulate data hunger and channel back the benefits of scaling toward protecting vulnerable and historically disadvantaged communities, but involving communities in labeling data and bringing their contextual and embodied knowledge and making annotation an kind of iterative, reflexive process. And that sort of emphasis on collaborative coding, which goes simultaneously with data capitalist criticism, is what we are trying to propose. And I think decolonial critique has been very helpful in building ethical scaling as a framework for us.
Very detailed response, and I think that one of the most interesting points of the article is the comparative approach, the comparative languages approach, and it's quite refreshing because sometimes AI research tends to focus on a specific technology or in a specific context. So having this comparative approach really gives like the general overview of what is happening with content moderation, and also to see the limitations of content moderation within the same platforms that allows to see like the heterogeneity of these type of topics. So passing to the next question, what can social sciences contribute to content moderation research? I remember reading about the importance of adding an ethnographic sensibility to this topic. For example, are there contributions beyond methods, or maybe methods is the way that your paper can contribute to this broader discussion?
I think method is a huge question. Even before we get to social sciences, I think we should give a nod to impressive empirical work and experiments that are coming from computer scientists and computational linguists. And we've greatly benefited from these works. And in our article, you can see that this is an interdisciplinary collaboration. There's a computer scientist on board, there's a computational linguist, there's an ethnographer, and of course, the contributions have come from fact checkers. So clearly, it's not just multidisciplinary. I would say it's also multi-stakeholder kind of an article. So research is also emerging about different languages. It's a very good point that you mentioned, Natalia, that different languages have not been investigated as thoroughly as English language has been, for instance, when it comes to content moderation. But clearly, in recent years, we see there are several fascinating projects on different languages. A recent study on hate speech in Portuguese language, No Hate Project at the University of Lisbon. I was fortunate to go there and give a talk recently. The University of Lisbon and partner institutes have created a valuable data set and analysis of racist and anti-immigrant speech in Portugal. And they've also tested NLP models. So these efforts are always happening. And of course, a lot is happening around AI regulation. Contributions are coming from different disciplines, policy studies, communication studies, science and technology studies, to just name a few. And many of them are, of course, are already interdisciplinary, right? When you talk about science and technology studies, they are drawing upon different disciplinary traditions. But I think as someone who is rooted in anthropology and somebody who is also drawing upon communication studies, because I have two different hats, communication studies and anthropology. But I think I can talk a little bit more about anthropology, because often people wonder, hey, what has anthropology got to do with big data, etc.? So I think what anthropology brings to these discussions is the focus on cultural contextualization. For example, in the ethical scaling article, we show that we cannot label extreme speech without reading it alongside target groups, because the same expression can be regressive in some contexts and emancipatory in other contexts. So identifying target groups is a critical component of extreme speech labeling. And anthropology, of course, brings with it the valuable tradition, methodological tradition of ethnography. It is not only about holding informal discussions and hanging out with people, but it is also a reflexive engagement. And I think this is very valuable. When we partnered with computer scientists, it became clear that what they considered as legible categories for sorting data didn't sometimes make sense to us as ethnographers. Our reflexive engagements and a deep consideration for how our own positionalities can shape our approaches helped us to challenge some taken for granted categories, especially in relation to misogynistic and racist speech. And therefore, I think these reflexive engagements are going to be very important. Anthropologists see language as living entities that emerge in social practice. Meaning is visceral, embodied, and therefore we cannot just take an analytical approach. I would say these are interventions which are quite important in the field of content moderation.
And if anyone wanted to research AI and content moderation, where should they start? Apart from reading everything that you have done, apart from reading anthropology, what else can they check?
Yeah, I think we could, of course, give a long list. There are very many curated sets of studies now. But definitely, I would just answer your question by defining an approach that is interdisciplinary. I think it's always helpful to start with empirical studies to see where it's going and what are the latest findings. And then in our own project, we benefited from that. We started looking into how computer scientists and computational linguists have started talking about this. What experiments have they done? What are their latest findings? Because as I mentioned, we know that this technology field is rapidly evolving. So our intervention has to be up to date in terms of how the technology has evolved. So I think to begin with, these empirical studies will be very helpful. But we cannot stop there. I think that can be a good starting point, but I would definitely urge combining this with critical perspectives, coming especially from critical cultural studies scholars and anthropologists. Because what is missing is this global perspective. A lot of the times, I think it's only about certain countries in the world. So our interest in global discussions is definitely shaped by anthropological training. And I think anthropology and critical cultural studies will be very helpful to take those empirical tests to a critical framework.
And also they can read the journal. They can read everything that's coming on constantly in the journal, because you really have a point there, and how it's not that new research gets outdated, it's that there's so much happening with AI and so much happening with the platforms that you just have to have really good literature and really good updated literature just to grasp how this academic landscape is moving super fast. Now, passing to the final questions, what challenges did you face while collaborating with others in this project? Because you have emphasized the importance of interdisciplinarity and how your team was with people from different backgrounds. What are the challenges of doing that?
Yeah, I think it was not an easy project to implement, really. This is a proof of concept project. It's funded by European Research Council, so funding was not a problem. We are very grateful to ERC for their generous funding. But as I mentioned, it's also a social intervention project. We were always trying to do something that could be seen as an intervention. So our primary focus has been on involving communities so that we are able to place politics and perspective into AI models. So we created spaces for direct dialogue among NLP researchers, fact checkers, and ethnographers specialized in the regions and languages. And we realized that there are quite many challenges. First of all, whom should we consider as reliable community partners? Because fact checking is also getting partisan. It is also a weaponized term for political parties. We decided on relatively independent fact checkers, by which we meant those who are not part of large media corporations, who are not part of social media, of course, and also who are not part of political parties. And we also looked for fact checkers who had an affiliation with the IFCN. So these were some of the parameters, but for anyone who is trying to have this kind of setup with community intermediaries or community partners, the key question will be, who are these community partners? How do we decide that these are my reliable community partners? I think that's the first challenge. And then this entire process is resource intensive and exhausting. This is not an easy process. There are uncertainties and contradictions at every step of the labeling process. Even when they were from the same country, two fact checkers did not agree on whether a passage should be considered as exclusionary extreme speech or whether it is just a derogatory expression. So there were differences all throughout. And in this article, we mentioned some of these complexities, contradictions, uncertainties. And that's what ethical scaling is highlighting, that we need to modulate data hunger and bring in these responsible processes of iteration and reflection. And definitely it's not easy, but it has to be part of the process. And then will companies do it? That's a big challenge because companies might not have a ready incentive to pick it up. After all, it is their anxiety to ensure online users ensure that online users don't flee their websites, that they are engaged in some of these content moderation practices, because their profit model hinges on user participation for value creation. And therefore, if users don't participate, it's going to hurt them. And therefore, they try to do different things. They're also responding to regulatory pressures. No doubt about that. But whether this kind of responsible iterative process will become part of a corporate model, it's a very it's something that we cannot answer, and we see that as a challenge, right? And finally, how the big question or the big challenge is, how do we push back against digital capitalism? By suggesting community participation and by saying that we need to do algorithm auditing, how are these models working, etc., and bringing in greater accountability in this entire process, we should not become complicit and avoid questions about business models of big companies. And that's precisely what ethical scaling pushes forward. It's trying to combine critique of capitalist data hunger and also simultaneously proposing a responsible process of community participation in vital areas such as content moderation. Because without having a responsible content moderation practice, we are going to let a lot of problematic expressions to fill up our social media timelines. I think finally, this is not just a single strand market critique. We push for intersectional analysis, attention to longer histories. And that's also sometimes challenging because not everyone is receptive to this critical framework. They're happy to be doing some empirical tests, and we have to push forward some of these broader critical interventions, I feel. And in this article, with extreme speech as our focus, we develop a decolonial critique of AI. And here we are in conversation with brilliant work of several scholars who have contributed to decoloniality as a critical framework. And in this article highlights the limits of the human-machine dichotomy that shapes moral panics in the West, and how we should see AI in relation to enduring structures of coloniality. And how can we reimagine these socio-technological entities beyond Euro-modern rationalities and moral panics? How do we bring in the voices and sensibilities of the rest of the world, so to say, to this AI space? That is a major challenge. So that's what we have tried to highlight in ethical scaling, offering a critique, offering some empirical material on extreme speech, and definitely, hopefully, some steps to address extreme speech with a collaborative coding model.
Yeah, and understanding that AI research is such a big challenge in itself. Are you planning to keep on researching AI content moderation? What are the next steps with your research?
Yeah, I think this cannot be stopped now. We are probably in the middle of a storm, or although I must say that in different countries, the storm has either receded, has gone up, so there are variations. So we have to be mindful of that. But that's clearly the kind of global approach that I'm very excited about. So I will definitely continue to work on this topic. I'm currently writing a monograph on AI and extreme speech, focusing on different materials that I've gathered over a period of time. And there's a new European Research Council project on contentious speech on small social media platforms beyond the big tech. And how are they engaging with AI? And that is going to be a key question in that project as well. So we are excited to kickstart that project. It's a 5-year project. It's going to be a large team of postdoctoral fellows and also consultants, etc. So I'm very excited about that. Hopefully, there'll be many more exciting events and collaborations at the Center for Digital Dignity. So this work will continue, Natalia.
Thank you for all your responses. Would you like to add anything else that we have left behind, or that's it?
No, I'm good. You covered everything. I think we're.
That's great. I think that on my side, I just leave everyone invited to read Ethical Scaling for Content Moderation, Extreme Speech, and the Insignificance of Artificial Intelligence, because it's not any paper. It's a very important paper for the journal and also for several fields, and that's quite interesting and quite unique. So everyone invited to read the paper. That's it. Congratulations once again.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye.